horrified and outraged. But I also remembered that I was shocked and horrified and outraged before by the deaths of Philando Castile and Tamir Rice and Michael Brown and Renisha McBride and others. The list goes on. You don't have to be a historian to know that current events are inscribed in a history of violence, a history of racism, a history of white supremacy, a history of struggle, and a history of resistance that's more than 400 years old. How do we make sense of what we're living through? Look, I've got a couple thoughts. One is that if we believe that Black Lives Matter, we need to open our eyes and our ears and our hearts to Black voices. And also, if we want to reckon with our current moment and our history, we need to listen to scholars of the Black experience who can give us some perspective. We are so lucky tonight to have a group of folks with us who can help us do that. They all have deep ties to the College of Wooster. They've walked our halls, they know this place, and they know this community, even as their scholarship has connected them around the world. And we're so thankful to them to be with us tonight. And she will introduce our panelists. But first, I need to say a few quick thank yous. Thank you, first of all, to Jeff Roche, professor in the history department. Jeff called me last week. You called me, you said, we need to make something happen to bring people together to talk about what's going on. And you made it happen. So thank you, my friend. Thank you to Yvonne Garcia, the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer, and to the President's Office for financial support in this. Thanks to Melissa Anderson, our Communications Director, for making the technology go. And let me say thank you to you, students, to showing up on a Wednesday evening during summer break. You didn't have to be here. No one's taking attendance, but you're here and that's meaningful. And everyone else who's joining us, faculty colleagues, staff colleagues, alums, thank you for joining. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Kabria Baumgartner. Professor Baumgartner is a professor of American Studies and Women's Studies at the University of New Hampshire. She's a leading expert on African American women's education. She's won awards for her scholarship and her teaching. She's the author of In Pursuit of Knowledge, Black Women and Educational Activism in Antebellum America. That's from 2019. She's a very dear friend of the Department of History, and we are so delighted to have her with us tonight, moderating this conversation. With that, let me turn it over to you, Kabria.
Thank you, Greg. And I also wanted to thank Jeff Roche as well for both of you for organizing what is, I think, a very important conversation that we're having right now. And I also want to thank other faculty at the College of Wooster and in the history department, because this is an important conversation, right, that involves all of us. So I want to also thank our panelists, my colleagues, Dr. Peterson, Dr. Shakes, and Dr. King, for their willingness to share with us their insights and perspectives about what's occurring now in our country and really around the world. So I want to first begin by introducing them and their bios. Now, they're all accomplished scholars, so their bios could really take up multiple pages, but I've shortened it just a bit. But I really urge you to engage with their work, especially their books, and you'll get a taste of that in this conversation this evening. We have Dr. Charles Peterson, who is an associate professor of Africana Studies at Oberlin College. His research interests include Africana philosophy, film, and Africana political and cultural theory. He co-edited the volume Decolonizing the Academy, African Diaspora Studies, and in 2009, he published his book, Du Bois, Fanon, Cabral, The Margins of Elite Anti-Colonial Leadership. He's writing a book now, tentatively titled Social Nullification and the Materiality of Black Life. We have Nicosia Shakes with us, who's an assistant professor of Africana Studies and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at the College of Wooster. A scholar artist, she specializes in African and African diasporic gender and sexuality studies, theater, popular culture, and political activism. She was formerly a researcher and the acting director at Liberty Hall, The Legacy of Marcus Garvey, which was a Pan-African educational institution in Kingston, Jamaica. Her forthcoming book is entitled Gender, Race, and Performance Space, Women's Activism in Jamaican and South African Theater. And then I'll introduce Shannon King. He is an associate professor of history at Fairfield University. He is the author of the award-winning book, Whose Harlem Is This Anyway? Community Politics and Grassroots Activism During the New Negro Era. His research and teaching interests include African-American urban and cultural history, Black freedom studies, criminal justice, and carceral studies. He's completing his second book, tentatively titled Policing the Crisis, Black Protest and Law and Order in New York City During the Riot Era, which examines race, crime, and punishment in New York City during the 1930s and 40s. So our panelists will share their insights. They will also engage in a conversation with each other. And at various points, I may pose a question, and then I will invite you, all members of our audience, to ask questions. I just wanted to begin by sharing some of my reflections about what has sort of transpired in the past 2 or 3 weeks or so. When I think about it, I think on the one hand that I'm pretty conflicted. If you're like me, watching all of this unfold, you might be feeling heartened, right, on the one hand, and then devastated on the other. I'm really heartened to see millions of protesters marching in the streets declaring Black Lives Matter. 5 or 6 years ago, I think to say Black Lives Matter was probably controversial for some people. And now even Target, right, and other corporate voices are affirming this movement. A movement, by the way, founded by Black queer women, right, in the wake of Trayvon Martin's murder in 2012. Those women, Patrisse Cullors, Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, are still doing this work. So I'm hopeful, I feel cautiously optimistic to see so many people exercising their right to peaceful assembly while holding posters, right, that say, no justice, no peace. But if you're like me, you might also feel immense anger and sadness that yet another Black person has lost his life, her life, or their life. There's another name to enter on that list of extrajudicial killings. So George Floyd is what we're talking about this evening. Breonna Taylor, who was gunned down by police officers who entered her home in Kentucky, serving an erroneous search warrant. We have Ahmaud Arbery jogging and then ruthlessly attacked. Freddie Gray before that, Philando Castile, Sandra Bland, Michael Brown, Botham Jean, and Tamir Rice, right? Then the list goes on, and it pains me to say that. And so now I'm wondering, really, is this the moment for change? And I want to hear from our panelists. I want to hear their own reactions to George Floyd's death and Breonna Taylor's death. And then this sort of response from, from millions of people across our nation, but also across the globe. So I'll start with Professor Peterson. Can you talk about your reaction to George Floyd's death and Breonna Taylor's death?
Thank you, Kabria. And I'm honored to be here. Thanks to all the organizers. Excuse me. Like you, I am of two spirits, two minds about this. The first spirit, which is, who I am as, as a person, which is someone who remembers the Rodney King uprising of 1992, who's around New York City a lot in the 90s. So I remember Amadou Diallo's murder. I remember the torture of Abdel Louima. So as a younger man in 92, it was rage, pure rage. I remember being in the streets of Atlanta. Actually, many of the images we've seen from Atlanta triggered my own memories. Literally seeing cars burning in the midst of the Atlanta University system, police provoking us, right, to respond with violence and force. And so as a man of almost 50 years old, instead of a man of 21 at that time, my rage also turns into sadness and grief and weariness. As you said, it's another name to add to that long list. I live outside of Cleveland, Ohio. So Tamir Rice, right, is a part of this region's memory. You know, I have three children, 2 sons and a daughter, and I believe that Tamir Rice is probably their first political memory. And so the first part of me is weariness and sadness and grief and rage all mixed together. The other part of me as a scholar of the Africana world and experience is like you, sort of provoked by this moment, provoked by the movements in the streets, provoked by the youth, right? It reminds me of a line from Fanon, and I'm just paraphrasing, right? Each generation out of relative obscurity must discover its mission, fulfill it or betray it. And it seems in amazing ways, this generation has discovered its mission, its historic place. And that's encouraging and it's exciting in many ways. And I'm, right, I will always be of two minds about this, right? There's the possibility of change and transformation, and yet there's the grief that remains with knowing the cost, right? What the family of George Floyd and the family of Ahmaud Arbery or the family of Breonna Taylor, and so many more, and so many names we don't know because there wasn't a camera there. There wasn't some type of recording there. But the price those families and communities pay to spark this expansion of consciousness in this movement.
Professor Shakes, would you like to discuss your reaction?
Yes, thank you everyone. Thank you to the History Department for organizing this, for the admin for supporting it, and for all of the other panelists. Some of you I've never met, but I've heard many people speak about your work. Well, first of all, before I saw the video or the clip of the video of George Floyd being murdered, I had already seen the video of Ahmaud Arbery being murdered, being stalked and then murdered. And I had listened to the 911 call from Kenneth Walker, who is Breonna Taylor's boyfriend, who was present when she was killed by the police, was initially charged with murder. I don't know if the charges have been fully dropped. It seems like they might be reopened. But I listened to, so interacting with that 911 call and those two videos, the first feeling is anger. Like other people, I felt a tremendous sense of frustration. I also have to think about what would have happened had there not been a video of George Floyd being killed, because we know that there are many, many other people, a lot of unarmed Black people who have been killed in similar ways, and the videos don't exist. So while we are having this nationwide and what has turned out to be a global process, because it resonates internationally and internationally as well, people in different countries are thinking about their own human rights issues, their own racial issues. While we are having what I see is as a global uprising, I also have to question the extent to which Black people have to always show proof of wrongdoing. What if there had not been a video? What if Darnella Fraser had not been there? That is the 17-year-old girl who took the video. I must say that I feel very optimistic. I don't know how much change can come of this. I've never seen anything like this in my lifetime. And so I'm very heartened by it. I feel very encouraged by it. there's a feeling of uneasiness I have with regard to the naming of the protests, and specifically the naming of the protests by the mainstream media as the George Floyd protests. And while I understand the need for memorialization, George Floyd's murder as the spark, one of these sparks of the protests, in addition to other killings, other human rights abuses, etc., I think that we need to be very cautious in how we frame it as protests that emerged, not just out of the case of George Floyd, but out of police brutality. I have actually been referring to it as the 2020 uprising or the 2020 protests against systemic racism, which is basically what it is. So I understand the memorial significance of the term George Floyd protests. To a lesser extent, I understand the use of the term Breonna Taylor protests for the protests in Louisville, Kentucky, but I am uneasy about what that means. We're not just talking about police brutality, we're not just talking about George Floyd. Something like this doesn't happen just because of police brutality. As horrible as that is, there's something deeper there. And I really feel like we have to reflect that in how we speak about it.
I want to give Professor King a chance to chime in, but I want to come back to the points that you made, Professor Shanks. Professor King, how did you react?
You wanted to come back to it.
Yeah.
So I wanted to thank everyone for the participation and the history department for inviting me, co-panelists. And, you know, I initially had something prepared that I wanted to say, but I'm moved by my two panelists' comments. Though they different in some ways, my own personal experience overlaps with theirs, particularly with Professor Peterson, and again, similarly being very close to 50, but remembering, you know, Rodney King and sort of watching, not being in Atlanta and not even being politicized enough to understand what was going on, although unfortunately I had already understood what police brutality was, because living in New York City, those kinds of issues were often on the news in the 80s. But, you know, that was generally a local, that was usually local news. And so what made 1992 important, of course, were the various responses in terms of not only in terms of Rodney King, but in terms of Latasha Harlan, in terms of the rebellions, in terms of the responses, but also, and most similarly, is that it was recorded, right? It was one of the first moments when, and this sort of links with what Professor Shakes was saying, was one of the first moments when the kind of invisibility that of violence that Black people experience hit the national news in such a significant way. And part of, and this sort of connects to what I wanted to say about my own personal feelings, when I saw it, I was a bit numbed, unfortunately, not only in terms of my personal experience and lived experience, watching these kinds of things on the news, again, whether it's 92 or before that, in various cases in New York City, but also because this is exactly what I write about. And so my research, I write about police brutality. I write about uprising or riots, or however one wants to frame them. And so, you know, I'm literally doing this historical work, but also watching it. And, you know, I'm really sort of caught up and overwhelmed in some ways because I'm exhausted because of the violence of COVID-19 and the death of so many people. And so this sort of adds on to that particular experience. I had all kinds of thoughts, both in terms of as a scholar who writes about these things, but also in terms of a person who sort of had, experiences with these issues since the 1980s, right? And so one of the things that I did want to say, as Professor Sheikh said, is that, these conversations are larger than the three people that we tend to say their names currently. And at the same time, I think it's important to say their names because, I think Professor Peterson said regarding his children and Shamir Rice, I mean, every generation has a particular relationship to, unfortunately, victims of police brutality. And I don't want to minimize that. But, these issues are wrapped up into much larger issues. And so, what the riots or uprisings are showing is that we can't do the bad apple framing that one often does, because now we see white people who are, and we see it recorded, right? People who are victims of police brutality, such as the older gentleman that Trump was tweeting about, which is both egregious and a political tactic. So I'll leave it there for now, but thank you for this opportunity to participate in this conversation.
Thank you all for sharing your reactions. I want to come back to Professor Shakes, and I'm thinking here of some of my students who, maybe don't have or aren't yet familiar with the history of protests. And I'm thinking about what you said, that it makes you uneasy to name this the George Floyd protest or the Breonna Taylor protest. Why does that make you uneasy? What are you afraid might happen with that terminology or that phrase being used?
Specifically, I am referring to the mainstream media, actually. So I'm specifically referring to the mainstream media. I'm actually kind of taken aback that this has been happening for going on 3 weeks now, and it's still called the George Floyd protests in the mainstream media. I remember when what we have now been calling the LA riots, the LA protests happened in 1992. I was very young and I lived in Jamaica, and back then it was being called the Rodney riots. And for many, many, many years, actually, I thought that these protests related simply to the beating of Rodney King. I actually thought that, because I was unfamiliar. I was very young and I was unfamiliar with the context of everything that was happening in Los Angeles at the time. It was when I got older and started to study urban segregation in the US, other names for urban segregation in the US, everything else that contributed to it, that I understood the full significance of it. So it is important to say their names. It is important to say as many names as possible. I do think that there is a limit to that, because you say certain names, there's a reason why certain names are said and others aren't by some people. There's an entire conversation about gender in naming, but I'm specifically referring to the mainstream media and what our work as academics will be when we teach about this, when we write about it, when we have conversations about it with regard to the name. So that's my discomfort right there. I've also seen it referred to as the George Floyd riots. So that is my issue from an academic perspective, as much as, and it's kind of a tension that I have, because at the same time, memorializing George Floyd is important. Memorializing Breonna Taylor is important. And it is important to see what sparked it. But even when we speak about what sparked it, it comes after COVID-19, after 50% of the deaths from COVID-19 are of Black people in the United States. It comes in the context of everything else, all of the other on-camera killings of Black people. It comes in the context of the prison industrial complex, right? So that is my specific uneasiness.
That's a good point. And I want to ask Professor Peterson this. So we think about the context of, let's call it the 2020 uprising. So we think about the context of it. Why do you think this moment, why is this moment electrified the nation and the globe, especially when you consider, right, Tamir Rice in 2014, 12 years old, right? You know, the protest there was protest, right? But it wasn't like this. So what makes this moment different?
I think there are a lot of factors that go into what makes this particular moment, significant. And to follow what Dr. Shakes was saying, I think certainly what you have is the stress of the overall circumstance of the United States at this point. Certainly the COVID pandemic has sort of added stress to the ability of the country to endure certain types or ignore certain types of shock. Certainly the effect that it's having disproportionately against the African descended African-American community. The economic downturn is a part of that. I will also add that I think that people are beginning to make these very direct, very obvious links. And when I say people, I mean, for the most part, the majority of white people. So they can see this repetition of murder and violence against Black bodies by police forces and private citizens, right? But then they can also see sort of the rhetoric that's coming out of the White House at the federal level, right? And in between those, you also have the emboldenment of the sort of white supremacist militia groups, right? And we're seeing sort of, be they very violent and very aggressive, or whether they be passive aggressive with the rise of the Karens and the Beckys. I think sort of Amy Cooper should not go unmentioned in terms of adding to sort of this atmosphere. So really what's happening, I think a lot of white Americans are seeing, right, this lineage, if you will, right, this social network of white supremacist violence against Black bodies. The other part of that I think sort of allows for people to be really aware of this, and you mentioned it earlier, you can't underestimate the level of organizing around this issue that's been happening since 2012, right? What happened to Trayvon Martin and the activists who did not stop this work, who continued to lay foundations and groundwork and maintain the organizations that were taking, right, paying very close attention to these incidents in their local areas. Once again, there's a very vibrant Black Lives Matters movement in Cleveland, right, that holds annual conferences, and so you have sort of a foundation, a network of, if you will, of activists and activist organizations that have continued to advocate for, to push for police reforms, right, to keep these incidents in the public eye. So that's a second feature. And I would also say, I'm going back to the point of the role of social media, right, and the role of the corporate media. And though there's a corporate media that tries to paint a particular picture, that narrows the lens, and certainly in the early days of the uprising, tried to focus on property damage, right, and what some would call violence in the streets. What you have through Facebook and what you have through Twitter and Instagram are alternative narratives being told, and information that would not make MSNBC or CNN, or certainly not Fox News, right? So you have these streams of information that are pouring out into the American public, right? And it's impossible, I think, for people to get away from, no matter what sort of media platform you're on, what social media you participate in, right? There's going to be someone there who's sharing, tweeting, trading, liking, so forth and so on. So the pervasiveness of this, I think, is having a huge effect upon people's consciousness and awareness.
Thank you. I wanted to turn to Professor King and ask about the history of protests, right? You mentioned that you study this. You look at New York City, you looked at Harlem, you looked at police brutality. How do you think that historical context, this history of protests, helps us understand this current moment?
Great question. My two co-panelists said some quite interesting things that I wanted to respond to. So I want to try to sort of connect the dots a little bit with your question. I think, what I heard from my two co-panelists is the role of media, the role of corporations, and institutionalized racism, and how that operates in multiple ways, whether it's through media or through movement networks. And so part of what's important to understand historically is that African Americans, people of color in general, have always organized and engaged in different forms of movements. And so part of what's important to understand, broadly speaking, about these movements is thinking about the differences between campaigns and actual social movements. And so just to give a more recent example, rather than a much later historical one or early historical one, I mean, we can think about Jena 6, for example, as this really early moment when there was this campaign around the violence directed towards these kids in the South, for example. And so that was in the news for maybe a few months, and then it sort of disappeared, right? But people were organizing around that. And so part of what's important to understand is that as people continue to organize, as Professor Peterson was saying, they're creating these networks, and they're creating an infrastructure that allows people to build upon when these issues are triggered, right? That's sort of straight, typical social movement theory, right? So for example, what people often do is when they think about the civil rights movement and they think about the 1960s, well before the 60s, you had the Montgomery bus boycott, right, in '55. Well before the Montgomery bus boycott, you had the Don't Buy Where You Can't Work campaigns in the 30s, right? In my own work in Harlem, there were strikes in the teens and the 20s. So there's always been these moments, but the question becomes, is there a critical mass that can build out from a campaign to a movement? And then how do we begin to learn about these issues in a way that people begin to connect the dots the way Professor Peterson spoke about, so much so that it becomes international, right? And so in terms of what Professor Sheikh says is really important, which is that not only are folks in the US involved, but it's a global movement now. But those responses pertain not only to, for example, maybe a police brutality in Brazil, but they're also connected to the different and nuanced ways white supremacy operates in those different spaces. And so the idea of Black Lives Matter becomes an important way to speak about these much broader issues that are not limited to police brutality. So one of the things I wanted to get back to is the media, because the media is really important in framing these questions. And so I was so, you know, I'm a bit surprised about what Professor Shakes was saying about the Rodney King riots. I think I heard that once before, but I had no idea. And it's such a sort of important way to understand the role of the media and the ways in which it creates a certain narrative. And then also how those narratives do a certain kind of work, right? And so if we limit it to George Floyd or Rodney King or Breonna Taylor, that means that it limits the conversation to the bad apple, right? The bad cop or the three bad cops. It doesn't allow us to talk about defunding the police, for example, right? It also lends itself to simple talking points, right? And it makes the conversation much easier. So that consequently, not only does the media help create these narratives, but now you have these protesters and movements having to respond to the narrative, which adds extra work on the folks who are trying to expose the issue in the very first place. And so one of the narratives that there's two quick narratives and then I'll stop. The first narrative, and I forgot to say this when I first began to speak, was I was waiting, I thought, when are they gonna criminalize George Floyd? And of course they start last week, or I think it was this week. As the first question was, when are they gonna criminalize? How do we change the narrative so that he goes from a victim to a criminal? So that we begin to question, well, why did he do these things? Or maybe he was guilty, or are there reasons? And so we've seen this particular strategy and tactic for decades, right? Whether we're talking about Martin Luther King, in fact, right? Or whether we're talking about George Floyd or Mike Brown and others, right? And certainly Sandra Bland was criminalized, for example, in an ugly, misogynist way, right? A second narrative beyond the sort of, the criminalizing narrative is framing the uprisings with this question of peaceful protesting and rioting and looting, right? And again, that sort of brings up these other narratives. And so part of what was frustrating was how, these 25-year-old, 19, 17-year-old young activists are having to respond to, not only are they out there putting their bodies on the line, but they're also having to respond to these narratives that have been curated partly by the media, but also partly by those who are against it. And sometimes the media takes those narratives and forces it upon these young folks, and all of a sudden you have this young person who has a microphone in their face and asking them to respond to, well, why is it so violent, right? I mean, that's a very daunting and problematic situation when clearly, arguably, one would hope that property is not as important and valuable as human lives. So I'll stop there.
If I could, I want to jump in 2 points. And the first one is to respond to the original question. We have to acknowledge the police as well, right? The overreaction, the militarization of the police, right? The abuse, aggression shown toward peaceful protesters really proved the point of the protesters. And I think that in many ways sort of galvanized sort of the attention of the American public and as well the world. The second point I wanted to make in terms of what Shannon was saying, is that this abuse of Martin Luther King that takes place when people begin to talk about certain types of activism, right? This misquote of King. And I tell my students, I was in a teaching yesterday about this. I said, look, King more specifically used the term sort of direct action and civil disobedience. Now, he would not have supported, so what we saw in terms of the property damage and the ways in which lives were endangered by protesters, but he was about sort of disruptive behavior, and he was about confronting the state, and what he never would sort of support in any way was, right, some type of submission, right? That's not what the plan was. And this way of, right, shaming certain types of activism, right, creating this sort of picture of MLK in heaven who's sort of nodding in disapproval, right, at what people are doing in the streets of Minneapolis, right, certainly serves, right, sort of the needs of the status quo, or the needs of a corporate media that really sells violence, right, as a way to raise ratings and to increase, right, the cost of advertising, right? So we have to think about all of that, the ways in which sort of the language and the ways in which the techniques and the goals of activists in the street can be so easily appropriated, in some cases misusing, right, some of our most noted sort of activist leaders.
Professor Shakes, did you want to share your reaction to Professor King and Professor Peterson?
Yes, and just to add to what they said about the movements that have been happening for decades really on the ground around police brutality, around prison reform, around systemic structural racism in general, that these protests resonate globally. And I've been using and pushing the term global Black solidarity because our fates are connected. So beyond the obvious fact of all people of African descent being connected through the history of slavery, through the history of colonialism, so that even Africans who were not enslaved still went through European colonialism, and those things producing the anti-Blackness that we know so well today. There's that connection that comes from the common African origin. But there's also the connection with regard to our social movements and the ways that you have so many individuals who were not born in America or didn't have American parents who were a part of these radical movements in the United States and who were inspired by movements started by people in the United States, so the Black Panthers and Black Power, for example. In 1914, Marcus Garvey formed the Universal Negro Improvement Association in Jamaica as an anti-colonial organization. He goes to the United States, and he goes to Harlem, and this is a spot of major Black migration from different places. And then within a year of him being there, you have the East St. Louis massacre and East St. Louis riots, then 1919 Red Summer, etc. And then the UNIA becomes a global organization, a massive, biggest Black organization in history from the base in Harlem. You have people like Claudia Jones, Trinidadian born, who was integral to Black radicalism during the first part of the 20th century, and I could go on and on and on, Stokely Carmichael, Audre Lorde, etc., Caribbean-born people. So this movement resonates a lot in Jamaica and by extension, the rest of the Caribbean. And there have been a number of solidarity marches and protests. On Saturday, there was a protest in front of the United States Embassy in Kingston, Jamaica. And there were other solidarity protests as well. Part of that has to do with our connection to the large Jamaican diaspora in the United States. 1.1 million people who identify as Jamaican live in the US. That is 1/3 of Jamaica's population, which is 3 million. That's a lot of people. right? And then you have more people who have American friends, who have American relatives, etc. It also resonates with regard to how we think about white supremacy and anti-Blackness as manifesting themselves in different ways in different places. So you have a large Black majority country like Jamaica, for example, over 90% Black, where I tell my students, the minority is actually the privileged. So it's the minority who are privileged, where you have a small group of elites who are mostly not Black people, and most of the poor are still Black people. And that comes from the history of slavery, in addition to histories of slavery and colonialism, in addition to class disparities, socioeconomic inequalities. So one of the groups that has been very central to some of the protests is Jamaicans for Justice, which is a human rights organization. It is one of the major organizations that seek to hold the police accountable and the government accountable, and they've done amazing work over the years. There are also other grassroots-based organizations who have been doing a lot of work, and they see what is happening in the US as connected to what happens elsewhere, so that we're in a Black majority country, which your existence as a Black person is different. It's easier. You don't have explicit white anti-racism from white people in Jamaica. You don't have Nazis and white supremacists marching down the streets with guns if they feel like, etc. But we link our socioeconomic inequalities to a kind of color class system in which poor Black people are at the bottom. And over the years, with regard to police killings, there's a problem there as well that is connected to Jamaica's problems with violence, with crime, and certain ways of policing that mirror military tactics or that use military tactics. So over the years, you've had a number of international and national organizations that have implemented changes, many of them good. One of them has been an independent commission of inquiry, which investigates and records and presents cases in which there was an extrajudicial killing by the police. I've heard some people call for that in the United States as well, among other things. So there's that entire issue of a hemispheric approach to policing. It's something that's found throughout the Americas. Brazilianists speak a lot about that. And there are a number of different cases that have come to the fore. Marielle Franco, famously assassinated, Joao Pinto, who was a Black boy who was killed when police or soldiers, I can't remember if it was police or soldiers, fired 72 shots into his home. So there is, even without that direct lethal form of white supremacy, there are other issues that Black people across the world contend with. And there's the issue of reparations, which I've been saying every time I comment on this, because I am of the opinion that we cannot solve these systemic inequalities without reparative justice, some form of reparative justice. The Caribbean has a very active, very robust reparations movement, the CARICOM reparations movement. And we've been making many claims to European countries. It's actually a reparations movement for slavery and indigenous genocide. So those together. And so Black people in different spaces, Jamaica, Trinidad, Brazil, the UK, etc., are looking at these protests in terms of solidarity, but also a kind of global movement that speaks to the many different ways in which anti-Blackness gets manifested.
Sure. I mean, I was just thinking about the 2011 sort of uprising in London, which was connected to sort of the police abuse of a young Afro-British male. I think about the 1979 Brixton uprising in sort of in London. I think about a really fantastic movie, a French film from 1995 called La Haine, which the driving sort of moment of the narrative was the French police's murder of a young man of color in sort of public housing in the suburbs of France. So, this idea of white supremacy as a global network, right? And there are a lot of points by which we can understand, and there are a lot of points of sort of sympathy, empathy, political sort of alliance, identification, right? In terms of how these other populations of African descended peoples sort of sympathize, but also say, yes, I've been there, right? In Brixton, I have been, or I could have been George Floyd, right? In sort of Marseille, I could have been Ahmaud Arbery, right? So I think that's what's also part of the galvanizing part of this, right? What makes this such an amazing sort of globally electric sort of moment for particularly peoples of African descent, but also their various sort of political allies.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
This is fantastic. I think I could ask more questions, but I do want to have our students have a chance to ask questions. So let's invite them into the discussion now. What are your questions? What are your thoughts? What are your concerns? So if you'd like to ask a question, whether it's one you already submitted or not, you can raise your hand using the Zoom button, and I'll call on participants, and I'll be able to bring you into the conversation. And I just wanted to come back to Professor Sheikh's points too about global Blacks, to echo that. What Professor King said about narratives, being mindful of those narratives, particularly from the media, criminalizing Black people, or creating this dichotomy between peaceful uprisings versus violence. And then of course what Professor Peterson has said about white supremacy as a global network. So maybe those will be some questions that students will ask. So we're just waiting for the students. So we have Ishwar Harris who will ask a question.
What if King had done this? It would have saved a lot of time on his travel schedule. Let's do Zoom fundraisers.
I think you're muted, Ishwar. If you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay. All right, this is Ishwar Harris. I taught at the College of Wooster. It's good to see Shannon and others on the panel.
Hey, Ishwar, how you doing?
I'm doing good, Charles. How are you?
Good to hear your voice, man.
Thank you. I want to bring our attention to the present crisis. It's good to hear the history, and thank you so much. I learned a lot about the historical background from your conversation. But my question, which I also submitted in written form, is this. It has to do with what can we do now? The question I have is two parts. Number one, what kind of laws favor the police in the United States today? And the second part of question, what can be done to change these laws to bring this systemic racial prejudice that we have in this country? Anyone?
Great question. I actually would like Professor Sheikh to answer this first, in part because she mentioned reparative justice.
Okay.
Can you say a little bit more about that and how that might be one pathway forward?
Yes, so reparative justice, for those who are familiar, refers to basically compensation for a past wrongdoing. In this case, it is slavery. In the context of the United States, there is an article by James Stewart in Africology, don't remember the year of the article, where he speaks about expanding the case for reparation in the United States to segregation and to other things, the certain eugenics experiments done on Black people, et cetera, et cetera. So it is compensation for a past wrongdoing. And that does not mean every Black person getting a check. So many people, there are people who think that that is what reparations is. It's not that necessarily. With regard to the US movement, I am not up to date on the specific demands of the US reparations movement, but I know that the last time I checked, it included things like investments in Black institutions, HBCUs, investments in Black communities, et cetera, et cetera. And many of us who are pro-reparations are of the opinion that if we think of structural racism, so we're not just thinking about police reform and prison reform, structural racism, right? Which is a set of policies and laws that seem race neutral, but really are designed in a way that privilege white people and underprivileged people of color. Now, structural racism, the strong argument is that structural racism was really a replacement of what was back then called Jim Crow or segregation era laws. So specific laws that said, Black people can't do this, Black people can't do that. And if we trace it back to the injustice of slavery, then what that means, and we look at housing disparities, health disparities, disparities in educational investment, then reparations has to be a part of any kind of racial justice project. I know Congress is debating a bill to pass reforms on policing. I don't know how sweeping those reforms are. I know that activists are still calling for more robust reforms. In Louisville, Kentucky, there's a call to pass a law banning no-knock warrants. That is part of the process. But as I said again, and one of the reasons why we bring up reparations is this is not limited to the police and to prisons. It is really about systemic changes. I also think it is important for us to understand the work that is already being done, which Dr. Peterson mentioned earlier. So there is a lot of work being done. There's the Innocence Project. And so it's important for us to figure out ways that we can support that work that is already being done. I've made that point in Jamaica as well, because this is a question that has come up a lot in terms of where do we go from here? And I think it's very important to amplify the voices of the people who have been doing the work for decades and find out what resources they need to do this work.
If I may add to that, Duke University economist Sandy Darity just published a book, From Here to Equality, Reparations for African Americans in the 21st Century. He's been doing a lot of that work. And I would, on top of that, I would add that, and I've had a few students ask, well, what can I do now? What can we do now? Certainly, I think what's important is sort of the protests with very defined immediate goals, right? Continue to take place. I think we've seen some success with that in Minneapolis, where the Minneapolis City Council decided to not only sort of defund, but actually are moving toward abolishing and recreating the police force or the public safety force for Minneapolis and Houston. It was announced by the mayor during Gregory Floyd's memorial that it would ban these various sort of chokeholds. I think there are sort of micro level and macro level things that could be done. And I think certainly activists and sort of people engaged in the electoral process, right, can begin to demand and push and protest and call for sort of banning of certain types of policies, or rethinking about the relationship between sort of militarized police forces in their cities, active examinations of the use of force policies in their cities, and really begin to question sort of what's undergirding, right, this relationship, right, specifically. So we also have very reactionary police unions, right, who are engaging, who sort of hold to a very fascistic sort of perspective in terms of their relationship to the public. These unions have in their contracts, very specific thing. In many cases in their contracts, they have sort of policies that sort of protect them from the type of accountability, right? I think New York, the state of New York just passed a law where it overturned a file. It was kept secret, sort of the violations and the misbehaviors, right, of New York State police officers, right? Now they've overturned that law, so now these records become very public. And you know what officer is doing what and who they've done it to whom, right? So I think these are sort of micro level things that people can do on top of the, addressing the much larger questions of structural inequality, the legacy of enslavement and colonialism and various forms of slavery, right? So I think that people can function at a host of levels, right, in terms of doing this work.
So just some quick stuff. So I have 5 quick points, very maybe useful. So from Ferguson, from Cleveland and other places, those departments were investigated by Department of Justice. There were consent decrees which required those departments to be reformed. When Trump became president, and I'm forgetting, can anyone remember the name of the secretary then? The guy from Alabama?
Jeff Sessions.
Jeff Sessions said that he was not going to abide by the consent decrees, and so there was no enforcement. So there's that. So that's the sort of federal. The second one has to do with questions around stop and frisk. And that's the Terry v. Ohio. I had to Google it really quickly, 1968. And basically that allows police officers to stop you with a lower standard. And that standard would be reasonable suspicion. And so in the case of New York, you had the whole stop and frisk debacle. But that actually continues to happen. And so so in other words, sort of trying to get at police power. 3 is what Dr. Peterson talked about in terms of police unions and arbitration in the ways that they can challenge the efforts of the police commissioner and in the mayor. And that's exactly what happened in Minneapolis, for example, right? That it's built into their collective bargaining contract. The 4th one is having a clear sense of the relationship between the district attorney and the police departments, right? And so again, in this particular case, it's important that Ellison is the one handling the case because the communities didn't trust the district attorney there. And we saw the same case in terms of Ferguson. There's another, that's also connected to grand juries and their ability to shape grand juries to get an indictment in the first place, right? Another one, the 5th one would be community review boards, right? So there are various ways of addressing these issues, whether it's at the federal level, whether it's at the local level. With that said, to me, the more important issue is not to forget that policy is not the objective. Policy is the means, right? And so if we don't remember that policy is the means, we don't equate new policy with ending the problem, right? And so the easiest example would be the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which was gutted in 2013 after Obama won, right? Or the Housing Act of 1968, you had legislation, but the Nixon administration and other Republican administrations didn't enforce the laws. So to me, policy is really important, but remember, it's the means. And so I hope that as people, however they find a way to get involved, that they don't lose sight of the fact that when these policies are put in place, people organize to go against them, right? That there's a conflict, and that in many ways, some might even say that there are laws on the books that if they were enforced, there would be less police brutality, right? I mean, that's an important conversation to have. And so, although I think policy is really important, I don't want us to think of it as the goal, but think of it as the means to freedom and these other issues.
I mean, I would say, I try to sort of, for myself and my own sort of mental organization, I try to keep things sort of, very simple. And I would say, look, donate, march, vote, read. 4 most basic things you can do in any sort of elaboration of that. But, to agree with, or to sort of link to what Dr. King was saying, ultimately, citizenship is a process. It is just not an act. It is not just if you vote, voting on, right, the first Tuesday or whatever of November or during the primaries. It's just not writing a check to a candidate if that's how you participate, right? But it's voting, and then the next day saying, okay, you're going to do what we voted you into office to do, right? Or it's going to be willing to be prepared to protest and march and do all of these things, right, that maintain the pressure upon the people, if you believe in electoral sort of process, right, to get them and remind them, you work for us, you are a public servant, right, and that is your job, right? So I would say that, I mean, it's a very complex thing, and I think right now we're beginning to see through these uprisings, the complexity of the politics, and certainly the complexity of the adversaries against, right, certain types of freedom, right, and the desire of African Americans, African peoples, to live lives of dignity and sort of freedom, right? But it's a constant awareness, and there are multiple tools, right, that can be utilized at various levels in order to sort of push this agenda along.
So this is kind of, we're, I guess, a little off schedule, but this conversation, the points that you've all made are so important. I think we will take a few more student questions. And so we might end up going a little bit over, but I think this is just such an important points that you all are making. I think Angela Danzo Gian has a question, and I'm sorry if I mispronounce your last name.
Oh, what happened? I think we lost her.
Yeah, hello, yes.
People who are, and as people who are always engaged in this type of dialogue and reading about it, it's kind of like what Dr. King was saying, that when we first heard it, we were like, and another one, okay, not much shock. So how do you go about dealing with not being jaded to it all? Because you read about it all the time, and you know about the institutionalized racism, and it's like, oh, and another one happens, and many people go through the shock and the outrage. Then it's like, you're always outraged because you're always engaging in these sort of things. So how can you go about not being jaded? And then sort of like a follow-up question is, how do you go about educating other people about it? Because when we go to PWI, so you're always the kind of point of contact when it comes to any sort of dialogue regarding Black Lives Matter or anything to do with Black history, kind of educating people, but then still kind of taking out the anger from everything, being able to just engage in the dialogue and not being jaded by it or getting angry by it.
Great question. What advice do you have for Angela to not be jaded and also to help educate others? Well, Professor King.
Hilarious. First of all, I want to say that it's wonderful to see you, Angela. A history major and Africana studies major. I think it's really difficult. I think personally, it's important for you to carve out space to take care of yourself before you can engage other people. So that, your outrage isn't channeled when the goal, if you're engaging other people, is to build a community. So the first thing I would say is you have to take care of yourself, and sort of bring hope and happiness to your life as best that you can. Think about your friends in your community and use that, for some people it could be yoga, for some people it could be television, for some people it could be dancing. I don't know what it is, but you have to organize your life around happiness as a buffer anyway against any kinds of oppressive forms of racism. So take care of your mental health. The second thing is two things. The first is acknowledging that everyone can't come along, right? Everyone is not going to agree with you, and some people are just not interested, and that's fine, because what it means is that you know who your community is. The second thing regarding sort of is related to when you do find people who are willing to have an exchange in a sincere way. And there are various tools that one can learn, but it's really breaking these issues down to in my mind, the most simple issue, which is Black Lives Matter. And if you don't understand Black Lives Matter, then we can't have the conversation, because much of what we're talking about really means that this country's history has criminalized and dehumanized Black people in such a way that those ideas are constantly being reproduced through institutionalized racism. They're reproduced through the media, for example, through these various narratives. And so what that means is various structures have been created to do that work. Structures, practices, and ideas. Structures, practices, and ideas. And that's a very simple way of talking about it. So whether it's the idea of criminalizing, whether it's the idea or whether it's the structures of a police department and different policies, and then whether it's the actions of implementing those policies to punish people, right? That's a really simple way of understanding these questions, right? Beyond the particulars of who the victim is, when it is, and why. If you can't agree that Black Lives Matter, then it's a hard sell, right? Because ultimately, we know, I think we know, and I think the reason why this huge global uprising is happening is that white people know too that they're treated differently than Black people, right? That's the basic issue. And they've chosen, white folks and other allies have chosen to say, we're not gonna stand for this because this just isn't right at a very basic moral level, right? Right? And so what that means is that in a simple way, and social scientists, and I'll stop here, there's a lot of social science research that basically lays out that if you have a Black person and a white person who commit the same crime, the Black person has a longer sentence, et cetera, right? So we know that it's not about the crime, it's about the dehumanization and criminalization of Black people. And so I think that's the basic question, regardless of whatever solutions we offer that we're talking about. And so that's where I would start. It's a long answer, I apologize.
So taking care of your mental health and then having those genuine conversations with people who can affirm that Black Lives Matter. Okay. We have one more student question. I hope I say your first name right. It's Tashal Harris.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. So, good to see everyone. Hi, Dr. Shakes.
Hi, Stacial.
Facial, sorry.
So currently I've been seeing around the country, colleges and universities, students have been calling for like a reevaluation of the colleges and universities' relationships with police and also campus security. And even Worcester has student and alumni come forward with a proposal.
Oh. Michelle?
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, so I must have disconnected. It's storming here in Worcester. So just the idea of moving away from security and police on campus and moving more towards a way that helps restore on campus versus punish. And I think that we kind of been met with a wall. Nothing has been decided yet, but how do we get the college to move beyond just wanting to do trainings? Because I think trainings are a great thing, but oftentimes on college campuses, they're the only things that end up happening.
It's been a while since I've taught at Worcester. I left in 2013. So I'm not as familiar with the framework, with the lay of the land as I once was. But certainly what I know students of color, our BUSWA, our Black Student Association has done, they've already prepared, right? Thinking toward the beginning of the semester and already put together a list of demands, right, for the administration to contend with. Many of them dealing with the particular lives of African descended students, but also thinking about sort of the Department of African Studies, thinking about questions of housing, curriculum, all of these things. So I think, Stachel, I think organizing among your peers and your allies, being very clear about what you want, what's necessary for a healthy and productive sort of matriculation on the campus, and making your points very clear to your administration and your faculty, right, in terms of what is necessary for you. So I would say organize, prepare your ideas, prepare your thoughts, and begin to, if necessary, plan whatever actions are necessary to emphasize and sort of make very clear what your organization wants.
Yes, thank you.
Could I say something?
Yes.
So I've noticed, and I love the questions, and I don't want to hold up too much time, but what I noticed, we've gotten questions from people of color, right? Students and faculty of color. And I want to say to the white students, if you're listening, that, and I said this the other day, that there's a lot that sort of, obviously there's a tradition, there's a history, there's ongoing actions that African descended peoples have been engaged in to deal with these problems. But first and foremost, these issues are a problem of white supremacy, and white supremacy is a white problem, right? It is a failure on the part of some white people, a lack of imagination, the inability to embrace and understand the need for an inclusive society and the humanity, right, of African descended peoples and peoples of color from other communities. And I would say, I have a sense, maybe your hesitation, your fear, your self-doubt. How do I get in? What do I do? How do I not sound like a racist person? what your community has to do is be brave, and be brave enough to make mistakes, right? But to challenge yourself, right? To understand, many of you, I'm sure, understand your privilege. If you've taken Dr. Shake's class and Dr. King's class and the other great professors at Wooster, I'm sure you understand your privilege, but you've got to be courageous enough to push through that.
Yeah.
Right. And to challenge yourself, challenge your friends, challenge your, maybe have some difficult conversations at Thanksgiving dinner. Right. Maybe challenge that uncle or that aunt that thinks Trump is the greatest thing that ever happened to the United States of America. Right. But first of all, this is something that people of color are not in control of. We're responding to it.
Yeah.
Right. We bear the brunt of it. Right. But the real work of destroying white supremacy has to be so connected to the actions of white people. Right. So be brave, be courageous. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. Don't be afraid to say to your friends of color, your Black friends, I'm not sure about this.
Yeah, yeah.
Right?
We have quite a few students who have their hands raised now, and I do think this is a conversation that we will have to continue, and those are really powerful words, Professor Peterson. I want to go to one more student question, and then I'd like to bring in our special guests. So we'll do one more question, and then we'll go with our special guests. Sophia Beagleisen. I think she may have, she with us? Okay.
Hello. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So I just wanted to ask, let's see. Okay. I think all my technology is working now. Sorry about that. But anyway, I was talking to my roommate recently, and my roommate is from India, and she said that she doesn't really know a lot of the context of American history, and she didn't really know how to start becoming more involved with everything that's going on, even though she is interested. So I was wondering if you had any suggestions for how we could, like, I know it's a global movement, of course, and global thing that's going on, but I was wondering if you had any suggestions for how international students could start to learn more, and how I, as an American, could try talking to her more about these kind of things. I didn't know if you would recommend just conversations, or maybe point them to some reading materials, or what kind of suggestions you might have.
I have some suggestions. So you say your roommate is Indian?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Because part of the conversation, as I said earlier, has to do with the global resonance of this movement. And it began in the United States, and that has a lot to do with the context of the United States and how race and racism happen in the United States. But there is a global resonance, including in Asia, which is a continent that many people don't associate with Black people, but there are people of African descent and Black people in Asia. And there have been complaints about anti-Blackness and anti-dark skin with regard to dark skin, Southeast Asia in particular. There are a lot of African immigrants in areas of East Asia who face discrimination recently with the COVID-19 pandemic. African immigrants were being targeted in China, right? Being targeted as somehow contributing to the spread of the virus. So the first thing is to understand how white supremacy happens internationally, and how anti-Blackness and anti-darkness happen internationally, and how are these things happening in our own countries. And so with regard to familiarity, and most of us being more familiar with our own countries, we can start with that. Secondly, with regard to the United States context, there's an excellent lecture on structural racism on YouTube. It's called How Structural Racism Works. And it is delivered by Trisha Rose, who is a professor of Africana studies at Brown University. It's a lecture that I show to my students every single year. It's very short and it's very educational, and it really breaks it down. If you go to the website of Black Lives Matter, there's a lot of information there, not just on Black Lives Matter, but on other movements that are happening. So it's very important, as I keep saying, because one of the things that we're seeing shows of solidarity from institutions and spaces in which anti-Blackness is happening. And so, for example, the British Museum recently tweeted that they support the movement for Black lives. And then my response to their tweet is, will you return all of those artifacts from Africa and the Caribbean then, since you support the movement for Black lives? So seeing it with regard to an anti-racist project, an anti-colonial project, and each of us in our own spaces can contribute to the work of anti-racism and anti-colonialism.
Can I make a quick point? So I think the history department is putting together a reading list as well. So you could check that out. I did want to say something about what Professor Peterson said that was triggered by what Professor Shakes just said. I think one of the things that we have to think about is, why does Target or why does the NFL begin to support this movement or movements? In other words, why do these corporations all of a sudden support these movements? And basically it's because the movement has broadened from Black and brown people and queer people to a larger and much diverse population of people who are involved. And so before, where there was consent to police brutality, there's less consent, this rebellion. And so now these corporations realize that a lot of consumers support this movement. And now that all these consumers support this movement, we have to send out a statement. And so it's important for people to realize that even in these cases where you see support, it's not really support. They're concerned about you going to their stores and you buying their products, right? The other narrative, and then I'll stop here because I know there are other questions, is when you see the police officers kneeling with the protesters. Again, that's accommodation, that's performance, right? So sorry, I'll stop right there.
No, that's real. Thank you for saying that. And thank you for saying your comments as well, Dr. Shakes. Definitely.
I think now is a good time to bring in our special guests. I know there are a couple more questions, and so maybe we can get to those questions after we hear from our special guests. We have Professor Leslie Wingard and Professor Mark Goulding. Professor Wingard is known to many of us, but for those of you who do not know her, she teaches African American literature at the College of Wooster, and she recently held a research fellowship at Princeton Theological Seminary. So let's welcome her. And then we also have Mark Goulding, who is very familiar with the Wooster History Department. He taught there over several years ago. And now he's a professor at the University of Central Oklahoma, where he teaches classes on the African diaspora, and his research is in Black radicalism in the 20th century. So we'll hear from Professor Wingard and then Professor Goulding.
Thank you, Professor Baumgartner. I'm really excited to be here. Hello to all my friends here on this panel, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me. As Professor Baumgartner said, I study and teach African American literature, religion, and visual culture. So two things that really are standing out to me right now are some images. One is of Donald Trump holding the Bible, kind of posing with it, right? and the other is of George Floyd, and it's featured heavily in a Christianity Today article. Floyd holding the Bible in the air, and he's surrounded by some of his friends from his neighborhood in Texas. So that's sort of triggering my response today. I'll keep it brief, but I just wanted to let you know that it's these images that are really resonating with me. I wanted to then introduce Christianity in general and the church and clergy in particular into this conversation, if I may. I can't help but constantly remember that Jesus Christ was a radical who was beaten, he was arrested, he was sacrificed on the cross. So in other words, he was a protester. Furthermore, protest signs that I'm seeing around town, in the nation and in the world often read, "Silence is violence," right? So I feel that just as those signs say, Christian leaders have an obligation to their congregations to speak on and act against racism. And this is a big thing for me that I'm really thinking about lately, the Christian leaders, I think, have an obligation to not conflate discussions of racism with other things, such as conversations about abortion. From cleanup efforts to sermons against systemic racism, so many more pastors of all political beliefs now seem to be slowly but surely agreeing that an effective response to recent Black deaths requires they listen to communities that are currently hurting the most. So that's really what's exciting me. And Mark, take it away.
Okay. Yeah, sorry about that. Let me first of all say thank you very much for Kabria and the Department of History and Worcester for inviting me to take part in this conversation. And it's really wonderful to see Leslie and Charles and Shannon again, and Nicosia and Kabria. It's great to meet you. You know, I woke up this morning, you know, I had been in contact with Jeff about this, and I was talking to my wife Amy and saying, well, you know, what do I thanks Charles what do I feel at this moment? You know, Jeff asked me, you know, what are you thinking about this moment? And my response was, I go between apocalyptic and hopeful, and I don't really I'd like to be wiser, but you know, I don't feel that I can. And I have to say, listening to the three of you, the four of you, offering your thoughts, your insights into what is obviously, we don't know what's going on. You know, we don't know what's going to come tomorrow. Gives me a little bit of hope. You know, maybe that's foolish. Maybe that's pie in the sky. I'll say just very briefly, because quite frankly, I want to echo what Dr. Peterson had to say, because I see a lot of white folks, in case you didn't know I'm white, you know, I see a lot of white folks sort of abdicate this discussion and say that it's, you know, it's for people of color to discuss racism and these sorts of things. And no, I don't think that at all. I think that it is fundamentally white people caused it. White people are going to have a fundamental role in fixing it. And people will get pissed off at me, and people will not like to hear that. And sorry, but I think that's fundamental. The other thing I want to point out is about education. We're here under the auspices of a wonderful institution, the College of Wooster, that, you know, I am now in Oklahoma, and I have taught students. I teach, you know, courses on U.S. history and diaspora history, et cetera. And I have met students from from Central Oklahoma who have not ever heard of the massacre in Tulsa, you know, in the early 1920s. And it's astounding to me that I can, white students as well as students of color. And it's astounding to me that we as a community, as a society, wish to brush this stuff under the table. And I want to make one other quick point, and I'll get off because I know I'd rather hear from students. I've been keeping assiduous notes as listening to my friends and colleagues. I think that perhaps at this juncture in US history, we want to ask, what exactly is the community? Who's in it? Who's not in it? Who's part of it? Like, what is exactly the community? How are we to understand what we as a community, if we're talking, the nation community, if you will, right? Or the state community, which is something I don't really like. But how do we determine that? How do we determine the ins and outs? And we need to rethink, just who is, and we need to open up. I mean, we are all here and we are all part of it. And I would, in finishing, I would say, if there are white students out there, other folks who might be looking at YouTube or what have you, we need to be part of the solution. We need to be part of the discussion. This cannot be left up to people of color, because we're the ones who need to dismantle it. And I'll stop at that.
I feel like, Mark, your comments remind me that what I'm most interested in is definitions. You seem to be thinking about defining community or redefining community. And I'm thinking about, is the religious right, is there a break within the religious right over race right now? That's one thing. And then also evangelicals, right? A lot of people don't know how to define that term anymore. So are we in this period where we really need to redefine it? So I like how you closed with thinking about the definition of community.
Well, thank you, Leslie. I find myself, coming from the East and being out here in the West, if you want to call it that, there's some debate. I find myself asking, like, how are these categories defined? And, I was just talking to someone recently, a good friend of mine who is, a devout Christian, about the ways in which people from my area of the country, from the East Coast, right, kind of automatically knee-jerk assume that Christians are, right-wing, conservative, et cetera, but that there's a much broader spectrum, and I think we need to open up. I think we need to, I'm not a particularly religious guy. I was raised Catholic, but I don't understand the sort of boundary making, within these different communities. I'm not trying to suggest that I experience the same America that you experience, or that Shannon or Charles or Nicosia or Kabria experience. Obviously, I don't. But we do occupy the same space. And I think it's all of our responsibility to maybe try to fix that space.
Yeah, opening our minds and opening up the definition of terms or concepts, I think they go hand in hand. In Black communities, often, evangelical means an entirely different thing than it does in some other communities. So things like that's on my mind.
And I think we're gonna have to wrap up our conversation, but I don't think will be the last conversation. This is really just a start. And I wanna give students something to take away. I like what you said, Professor Goulding, about thinking about community and the images that you juxtaposed for us, Professor Wingard. So as we're thinking about what we can do, here's my last question to our panelists. What advice or suggestions would you give to college students in particular who are trying to figure out how to get involved, right? And that includes maybe joining some of those protests, but also going beyond that. Maybe each of you can give us one thing, I know there are many things, right? But one thing that you would maybe suggest or advise for our college students out there?
Yeah, there are 1,000 things I can think of, but as in the context of being a college student, go to those classes that ask these questions.
Yes.
Support those departments and those professors that ask these questions. Support those administrators that ask these questions, right? The first thing to do is learn. Then everything else will flow from that.
I'd say open up your community of friends. Even if you think you have a diverse friend base, rethink. Maybe of all Black friends and you're Black, join some kind of small group organization with all white people and just see how you operate there. Think about who would be invited to the major events in your life, whether it be a wedding or God forbid, when you pass away, your funeral. Would they all look the same, do you think? Just think about that. I've been thinking about that myself.
I think education is a major part of the process, and by being in college, you have an opportunity that the majority of the population do not have, and you have to make use of it. So courses are important. It's also important to educate yourself about things like implicit bias, because there are students who will take a Black Studies course and then complain that they are made uncomfortable by the course. So at the same time, educate yourself about implicit bias and the ways in which racism also works in the educational process. To white students, 2 things you should not say to a Black person is, I feel guilty and I am so sad, and start crying. That's a tendency that you see among a lot of white people. And what happens is the Black person who is going through their own trauma then ends up caring for you instead of simply informing you. And anger can be an emotion that you utilize in a productive way.
Oh my God, you said 1. So education, and with that education, I would say think about who you are and how who you are is connected to something. So if you're an artist, maybe you would write poetry. If you're a photographer, maybe you would use your photos to communicate political messages. If you're an essayist, if you're a person who's interested in politics, you might, so whatever your vocation is, and I mean it sort of in a biblical sense, dare I say, whatever that is, whatever God has placed you on earth to do, use that for political purposes, and maneuver it to address these kinds of issues. Everyone can't be an activist or intellectual or whatever, but whatever your thing is, use that as a way to help folks out. So.
Professor Golding?
Sorry about that. Just to echo all of my colleagues and my friends' thoughts, and Dr. Shakes, I want to take up your point, the white students. Listen, stop talking and listen. You'll learn a lot. I feel that is, good advice for everyone. But at this moment, I think that where so many in the white community, so many white folks in this country simply don't get it, simply don't understand that they need to listen. They need to shut up and they need to listen. So that's my advice. Listen.
Be John Brown. And if you don't know who John Brown is, go do some research.
You can Google, yes, you can Google John Brown.
John Brown.
Yes.
His truth is marching on. Okay. I just wanted to actually repeat and echo what you all said. So learn, right? Everything flows from that. Open up your community of friends. Take advantage of the opportunity and privilege of being in college. Utilize your emotions productively, use your talent and interest for social change, and listen, right? So I'd like to thank our panelists so much for sharing their insights and perspectives this evening. I'll turn it over to Professor Cheyenne.
Thank you. I just got to say a huge thank you. It's amazing to see this group. It is just so wonderful to have you guys here. I can't tell you how meaningful it is to have you with us. So thank you, Kabria Baumgartner, Charles Peterson, Nicosia Shakes, Shannon King. You guys are awesome. Thank you. I want to say thank you to Leslie Wingard and Mark Goulding for being here also. It's awesome. You guys should hear the sound of applause coming to you. So I just want to close it by saying we've covered a lot of ground, but you know, we've just scratched the surface. Our wish for you, and I'm talking especially to students, is that you just keep going. You heard a lot of advice. We're going to share a reading list to everybody who registered for this session. And I hope you think about courses at the College of Wooster that will help you go further. And get involved in your communities and at the college. We need you. With that, I just got to thank our guests again, and then I think we're going to say goodnight.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you and good night.
Thank you.
Right,
Thank you so much. It's great to see you all.
Fantastic. See you in New York.
Say hello to Amy for me.
Yes.
I will. Thank you.
Hey man, send me your email.
Yes, I will. Yes, I'll send both of you guys my email.
I have the same number.
Did somebody screenshot this? I don't even know how.
It was streaming on YouTube.
It's recorded on YouTube.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Because I want to, it's like a family reunion.
I know.
We should get t-shirts.
This is.
Oh, I miss lunch back down at that place.
Oh, yes, it's not even there anymore.
I
That's right.
I missed the steakhouse. This is like a steakhouse night.
Yeah.
Now I stopped being a vegetarian, and now, go figure, I had to do that after I left Worcester.
How they treating you down there in Oklahoma, man?